Earlier this month, or rather at the end of last month, the nation of France was engulfed by almost 2 weeks of very tumultuous protest in multiple cities around the country, where the largely Muslim population, the poorer population in France, rose up in outrage because a 17-year-old French citizen, a boy of 17 years old who was of Algerian descent, was killed by 2 police officers, shot in the head by one after he was stopped unarmed while driving a car without a license. And the poorer people and the Muslim community and the immigrant community in France viewed this as expressive or representative of a disregard for the lives of the immigrant population in France and of poor people in France, and they protested in a way that made the George Floyd protest look pretty peaceful and pretty timid. And for a while, Macron and his senior officials in that government seemed to, if not sympathize with the protesters, at least they were willing to condemn the shooting. It was, if you look at the videos of it, and they're online, not even debatable in terms of whether they were an unjust use of force. They absolutely were. Macron said so. His government said so. The police officer has been charged with murder. And yet these protests continue, and they're obviously a byproduct, as protests usually are, not just of this particular incident, but of longstanding frustrations with people's lives and the way they're being treated by the establishment. So these protests have now largely subsided. The violence has been put under control by the deployment of police, and yet the French government seems eager now to exploit the anger and the fears over these protest movements to engage in some genuinely extremist and authoritarian behavior that I think is an important warning sign for us in the United States and the West more broadly about how Western governments are so adept at exploiting any kind of unrest or threats or villains or fears to destroy our basic liberties. You may dislike those protests in France the way you disliked the George Floyd protests, or you might have thought they were justified expressions against injustice. But either way, what the French government is now doing in the name of stopping these protests in the future is, I think, genuinely alarming. Let's look, first of all, at The Guardian from July 5th, this week, which was Wednesday. It says, the title is, Macron accused of authoritarianism after threat to cut off social media. The French president insists that Macron's aides insist the French president is not advocating general blackout, as ministers say rioters are using platforms to organize violence. So they immediately blamed social media, and Macron warned that in the event of future protests, they might just entirely shut down media in the entire country. This is what the article says, quote, the president's comments came as ministers blamed young people using social media such as Snapchat and TikTok for organizing and encouraging rioting and violence after the shooting dead of a teenager during a police traffic stop in a Paris suburb last week. Quote, we need to think about how young people use social networks in the family, at the school, the interdictions there should be, and when things get out of hand, we may have to regulate them or cut them off. Macron told a meeting of more than 250 mayors whose municipalities were hit by the violence on Tuesday. Quote, above all, we shouldn't do this in the heat of the moment, and I'm pleased we didn't have to, but I think it's a real debate that we need to have in the cold light of day, Macron told the mayors in a video obtained by BFM television. He's saying we have to seriously consider shutting down social media or severely restricting it in the event protest movements in the future happen like this. Imagine what Joe Biden might have done with this power when the so-called insurrection, the 3-hour riot at the Capitol on January 6th took place. They immediately blamed social media for that. Remember, AOC and Ro Khanna and other Democrats succeeded in pressuring Google and Apple to remove Parler, which became the #1 social media app after President Trump was banned from Twitter and Facebook, got them kicked out of that store, and then got Amazon, pressured Amazon to remove them from their web services, and Parler was crippled and never recovered. That's one social media site. Think about the power to just shut down social media every time you decree that there's unrest or protest in the country and blame social media for it the way social media was blamed for January 6th. Quote, critics said considering such measures would put France alongside authoritarian countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, Varan said the government had made a, quote, firm request to social media platforms to take down material encouraging violence as quickly as possible and remove the anonymity of those possibly breaking the law. Quote, a young person should know he cannot sit behind his screen and write, organize, or do whatever he wants. A young person should not think he can sit behind his screen and write, organize, or do whatever he wants. Anonymity in terms of offenses doesn't exist. You have to understand this can have consequences, and the consequences can lead to punishment, Varan said. Now, it seems like some people are somewhat sympathetic to the French government in this case, so I'm going to ask you instead to imagine that happening in the United States. Not with the protest of people you are opposed to, but of people that you sympathize with. That is what happened in the United States in the wake of January 6th. They did get very extreme about social media. They banned President Trump. They destroyed Parler. And that was when a much more rigid system of censorship has been implemented. Now remember, the EU is way down that path. At the start of the Russian invasion, the EU enacted a law making it illegal for social media platforms to allow Russian state media like RT or Sputnik to be heard. So if you're an adult in France or Germany or Italy and you want to hear what the Russian government is saying, you can't really easily access those social media, those media outlets because they've been made illegal. Rumble is not available in the entire country of France. This show is not available in the entire country of France unless people use VPNs. But by law, it's not because the French government ordered Rumble, even though it doesn't operate in France, to remove RT from Rumble. And when Rumble refused, it instead said, we'd rather not be available in France than obey your censorship orders. We'll sue you in court over this, but we're not going to comply, and Rumble is not available in France. Brazil has banned multiple social media outlets at various times for failure to obey its censorship orders. So the point is not, do you like these protests? Do you sympathize with the protesters? Do you think they had a just cause? Did the protests get out of hand? That is what they want you to focus on so that you acquiesce to their authoritarianism and their extremism when it comes to demanding powers to control the flow of information. The question is, do you think government should be able to shut down social media whenever, on their own accord, they decree that doing so is necessary to preserve social stability? Today, according to Le Monde, it's not just the power to shut down social media that the French government is claiming, but also allowing people's cell phones to be used against their will as spies on them that feed their data directly to French spying agencies. We're talking about French citizens. Quote, France set to allow, go back to that headline, France set to allow police to spy through phones. The article reads, quote, French police should be able to spy on suspects by remotely activating the camera, microphone, and GPS of their phones and other devices, lawmakers agreed late on Wednesday, July 5th. Part of a wider justice reform bill, the spying provision has been attacked by both the left and right defenders as an authoritarian snooper starter. The Justice Minister, Eric Dupond-Moretti, insists it would affect only, quote, a dozen or so cases a year. Covering laptops, cars, and other connected objects, as well as phones, the measure would allow the geolocation of suspects in crimes punishable by at least 5 years of jail. Devices could also be remotely activated to record sound and images of people suspected of terror offenses, not convicted of or even charged with, suspected of terror offenses like plotting a protest at the January 6th, on January 6th at the Capitol that turns into what the government calls an insurrection, as well as delinquency and organized crime. The provisions, quote, raise serious concerns over infringements of fundamental liberties, digital rights group La Quadrate du Net wrote in a May statement. It cited the, quote, right to security, right to a private life and to private correspondence, and, quote, the right to come and go freely, calling the proposal part of a, quote, slide into heavy-handed security. This is the dynamic that we constantly urge you on the show to be mindful of. The effort to constantly get you afraid of things so that you're more sympathetic to the government's demand for power. That was how we got the Patriot Act. That's how we got the surveillance state in this country, in the United States. We just saw an example of that where the government leaked all sorts of things incriminating about the social media app TikTok in order to claim that it wanted to shut down TikTok, but instead the law that was passed went way beyond that. to allow the Biden administration to shut down any social media site owned by foreign governments simply by decreeing that they pose a threat to national security, meaning the only social media companies that as an American you would be allowed to use are ones that would be subject to the rule of the U.S. security state. That's the kind of fear-mongering and dynamic that you constantly have to watch out for. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.